Welcome back to Creators in Motion by Portrait Displays. I have the privilege to introducing you to a true luminary in the world of color grading. Color grading is the art of shaping the look and feel of a production, and few individuals are as accomplished in this field as Cullen Kelly. With an impressive portfolio that includes working on Academy Award-nominated films and acclaimed series for Netflix and HBO, Cullen has established himself as a thought leader in the industry. But Cullen's expertise extends beyond his own work. As a master trainer for Blackmagic Design and a sought-after consultant for top colorists and post-production facilities worldwide, he is dedicated to pushing the boundaries of what's possible in color grading. What sets Cullen apart is his ability to speak the creative language of filmmakers. He understands that each director and cinematographer has a unique vision for their project. Cullen's role is to translate that vision into a visual language that resonates emotionally with the audience. To achieve this, Cullen delves deep into the world of color theory, meticulously fine-tuning every aspect of the image. His attention to detail ensures that every frame is optimized to its fullest potential, enhancing the storytelling experience. Join us in this episode of Creators in Motion as we delve into the artistry behind color grading with Cullen Kelly. So, welcome to a new episode of Creators in Motion. We are very proud and happy that we have our latest special guest here today. I was looking him up before he actually came here. He's quite a busy guy. For example, he's running his own masterclass, right? It's called Colorist Career Accelerator. It's great stuff, you can learn a lot. He's running his own YouTube channel, right, on top of everything with different videos, tutorials, everything you want to learn about color, right, training sessions, for example, and basically everything that's important for the job as a colorist, but also every other craft that's somehow related to filmmaking. And, well, we talk about that kind of job very soon, but working as a full-time colorist and full-time color scientist, not just on shows and programs, but as a consultant, is Cullen Kelly. Welcome to the show, Cullen Kelly.
Thank you very much, man. I'm glad to be here.
So we're very happy to have you here, Cullen, today. Well, how was your trip to Pleasanton?
It was very pleasant, to make a terrible pun. I'm a new dad, so I feel like I'm allowed to make dad jokes now. It was great. Yeah, easy trip up from LA.
Well, so we have a lot of different things to talk about today, and I think the first thing might be, maybe before we go deeper into the rabbit hole of color science and color grading, we probably want to first make sure that the audience gets to know you a little bit better. And so that said, maybe you want to talk a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in Pleasanton today here on the scene.
So I'm a colorist, I'm a color scientist, I'm an educator, and I'm really passionate about every link in the chain between sensor and screen in terms of the way that motion images are captured and reproduced. If it involves something in between those two goalposts, I'm interested, and I've probably done something in the space, and I'm probably talking about best practices for how to navigate that space. That's kind of me in a nutshell. And it's funny because once upon a time, I started my career in motion imaging in film school. I knew that I wanted to be involved in filmmaking. I was super passionate about cinematography, had always loved movies, always loved writing, and really dove into film school and just loved learning all of the different disciplines and sub-disciplines of filmmaking that I was exposed to there. And I had the opportunity to train under some amazing ASC cinematographers and other luminaries of the craft. But what was funny is at a certain point, I found my way at the time into a telecine suite where they were, like mastering motion images in the way that it was being done back in 2006 or 2007. And I remember walking in there and seeing the control surface and seeing the sort of darkly lit environment and the calibrated displays and the power windows that the artist was drawing. And I just knew, okay, this is for me. This is going to be a big part of my life going forward. And naively and sort of arrogantly, as you tend to think when you're young, it was like, okay, cool. I'm just going to go ahead and learn everything that I can about this. It'll probably take me about a year, and then I'll be a master of it. And now, whatever, 14 years later, I'm still just trying to get to the end of that year.
So yeah, that's right. I mean, learning, that's absolutely right. Learning is super important. And I think that's one of the important details in our industry, right? Because if you would give advice to young filmmakers or to our young audience, for example, and students, for example, film students, who just want to not just tell stories, but actually also get a vision across, what is it what you would think they should actually learn and what they should actually take care about, and what do they need to succeed in this industry and in this business? I mean, you never stop learning, right?
Absolutely, right. You want to, like that's something that I am constantly reminding myself and everyone that I work with and everyone who works around me to constantly be seeking growth. That is the absolute best recipe for any success that you could hope to find in this business, is to be pushing yourself to grow and never be satisfied with something that someone else told you is the best way to do it, or with what worked for you one time or 10 times in the past. Always be looking for what else could it be? How could I go further? How could I do a better job of this on the next project?
So yeah, 2006 you said was the time. So you were right basically in the middle, right, of the transition from in a very interesting time, like from analog video and analog and linear editing to non-linear editing and the digital filmmaking process. I mean, I think that was a very, very, very interesting time. And when you look at this time back, maybe you want to talk a little bit about those mentors and people that helped you to become the person you are today, when you saw what that opportunities are and which opportunities are coming with this new technology. Let's talk a little bit about this. Who were the people who helped you to become the person you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came into color grading, or what I sometimes even more broadly refer to as image mastering, in a really interesting time. That 2006, 2007 moment was exactly when we were making this transition from, on one hand, we had like the photochemical tradition where everything was being done with shooting negative and then printing negative and color timing, something that's been around for as long as motion imaging. And sort of the parallel path that ended up converging with that was color correction, which had been around for some time as well. And really that 2006, 2007 time period and the years following were when those paths started to converge, and we started to figure out, how can we author, how can we master, how can we manipulate motion images for a cinematic agenda inside of a digital environment? That was really the first time that those two things started to converge. And it was a fascinating time to get involved with color grading and image mastering, because no one knew what they were doing. We were all trying to figure it out. We had the digital intermediate, early days of DI, where everyone was working underneath what we now know as film print emulation LUTs, but at the time they weren't emulation LUTs as in like, oh, I'm going to make this look like a Kodak 2383. They were emulation LUTs so that the colorist knew what the image was going to be when the film was actually printed to that print stock. So there's all this fascinating transition and everyone trying to figure out, what does it mean to compellingly craft, to author a motion image in a digital domain, where we've got a little bit of precedent. We have color correction, but that's really a very different toolkit, a really fundamentally different ideology than we have with cinematic image mastering, what we could think of as the cinematic tradition. Color correction is much more concerned with, as the name implies, correcting or tuning or like balancing shots on a corrective basis so that the nightly news doesn't look too pink, or whatever the case may be. Very different set of concerns and tools involved in both. And as we know, both play a role in the role of what a colorist today does and what I do now in my daily work as a colorist. But this was a time when all those things were being figured out and sort of ratified for the first time. And then right in the middle of that, of course, came color management and ACEs, and it's been we're still very much in the adolescence, and that's something that I think we can easily lose perspective on. We're in an adolescence today in 2022 in terms of, wait, what does it mean to compellingly sculpt a motion image on a creative basis as opposed to on a technical basis?
Well, that's a beautiful answer. Absolutely fantastic. Well, I think that's interesting because Alistair Arnold, a senior colorist at Photocam, and he was also on our show Color Matters, another show we do. He said that people are painting pictures for about thousands of years, but movie making is an art form that's just 100 years old, right? So you're basically always learning. You never stop learning, right? And even today, right? we barely start to understand how we utilize high dynamic range, for example, how you get the best out of it, and how you use that and the language of HDR, for example, right? So it's not like a cookie 3D thing or a gimmicky thing, right, where you think people are just using it to create effects but not really driving the story, isn't it?
Absolutely. We're still figuring out all of these new technologies and how to exploit them creatively so that they don't become the next smell-o-vision or the next gag that we see periodically come and go through filmmaking. And HDR is maybe the best example where we're just now starting to figure out, like, okay, well, we may have a 1,000 nit deliverable or standard, but that doesn't mean we need to hit 1,000 nits. In fact, we may often not want to.
So again, looking a little bit at your career and about the lessons you learn, and maybe, avoiding the school of hard knocks, or maybe wasting time or money or energy. I mean, maybe, again, let's talk a little bit about the future of color scientists and the future and the generation of colorists. To really become successful in this industry, and this can be really hard, right, in this industry, and the competition is hard, and you probably have to face a lot of competition when it comes to high quality media production. What are the things that you would say, beside constant learning and knowing your tools, what is important? What do I need as a filmmaker, as a young person, to accelerate my career? I mean, you have your own masterclass, right, and other shows you're providing to help young people. What is it actually what they should take care of?
Yeah, so I've had the chance, as my career has gone on, to begin to reflect on what's worked really well for me, what have I struggled with or not understood for a long time before finally coming into a greater understanding of, like, what are the principles that if I could go back and tell young Cullen how to do this thing better, how exactly would I go about that? And I've really arrived at a couple of key principles. The first one is the idea that a colorist, what I do today, I'm a creative advocate. That's my role in the creative process, is to advocate in a really skilled way for the filmmaker, for the image author. It's not my image. I didn't design, I didn't create the image. My role is to advocate for them with my expertise. So the first thing is you have to cultivate that expertise. You can't be an effective advocate if you're not somewhat of an expert on the way motion images are not only captured, but manipulated and reproduced. So that's a big thing, is to build up a foundation of really understanding how it is that this magic trick of image capture and reproduction works. Otherwise, you can't effectively advocate for your client on a creative basis. Some of the other things that really stick out to me when I reflect back on what are the principles that I wish I'd had from day one when I began my colorist career. The other one that it just always comes to mind for me is not to seek clients, not to seek external results, not to seek prestige necessarily, to seek excellence, to continue to try and grow as a colorist, and those other things will follow. But if you chase clients, if you chase jobs, you will end up only rising to the standard of what you think you need to do in order to land that job or that client, where the principle for me is, this comes up a lot when I'm talking to younger colorists, where they say, gosh, am I ever going to be able to do that? That seems like such a lofty goal, to work on the next, studio film, or to color grade with this amazing cinematographer or director. And my response is always the same. I say, I don't think you're aiming too high at all. I think you're aiming too low. You actually need to aim higher and insist on maxing out your potential, not just insist on doing what you think you need to do in order to land that client or that job. So that's one principle that always comes to mind. Another principle that has really, really served me well as I've embraced it in more recent years in my business and in my color grading practice is to stop asking for things. No one has ever hired me because I really wanted the job. No one has ever hired me because, boy, I really want to be a colorist, or boy, I really want to reach this next foothold in my career. They hire me because I have value to offer. So if we as colorists, as professionals, can stop asking for things, stop seeking things, and start offering value in a compelling way to our clients, that's actually the way that we can land the jobs that we all want to land. We all want to be doing high-level work. We all have dreams of the kind of work we want to be doing and the people we want to be doing that work with. But if we can focus not on landing that job or that client, but on offering them value, that's a much better lens to look at the situation through, and really goes back to one of the earlier principles of building up your personal toolkit, maxing out your personal potential as much as possible so that you have something to offer.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of a book I read about Bill Walsh, the former 49ers coach. It was called, or it's called "The Score Takes Care of Itself," right? Why did he call it that way? Because actually, if you make sure that you put everything into place and everybody is performing in a very good way, then scoring comes by itself, right? So it's like you're disciplined. You make sure that you achieve your goals, and that's actually how you thrive for perfection, even if it's really hard to achieve, right? And so literally, I think this is pretty much like in sports, right? So from the receptionist to the quarterback, everybody was performing in the same way. Everybody was proud to be part of the Niners, right? And I think that reminds me a little bit about our industry, because you're growing and you're trying to move on, right? And get better every day, right? And so then the score takes care of itself. If you would describe how much that fits into your career, and on the motion picture side, literally, what would you say with all those analogies?
Well, it's funny that we're talking about sports, because I think about sports a lot, and I think about one of my great teachers in life, which has actually been the game of golf. I happen to be a terrible golfer, but I have a deep love for the game of golf, and golf has taught me a really profound lesson that I've found has huge application in all areas of life. But golf is perhaps the ultimate example of a process-oriented activity as opposed to a result-oriented activity. All you can do is work the process. All you can do is put the right ingredients into play. You cannot produce the result of, to make a silly example, of hitting a hole in one, or of like chipping a ball from near the green and dropping it into the cup. You can't do that. All you can do is inhabit a sound process and embrace that process, enjoy that process, and then watch over time as the macro level results net out where you want. But you can't control and extract results on an individual, explicit case-by-case basis in the game of golf, or in your career, or in life for that matter, in my experience.
So thinking about this, what moves you? I mean, the show is called Creators in Motion, right? What is actually moving a Cullen Kelly in this industry? What is it? What drives you? What makes you passionate about what you're doing every day?
This is such a fun thing to talk about. So what keeps me in motion? What inspires me? What motivates me to continue to practice my craft at a high level? For me, it really comes down to my clients and what they ask of me, because I have the privilege of working with so many fascinating, interesting clients, both on the color grading side, so the filmmakers and the image authors that I work with in that context, as well as the colorists and post facilities who I support with creative color science. No matter how much mastery I seem to feel like I have achieved of my craft, those clients do a really amazing job of humbling me with almost every project that I take on, where they say, "Hey Cullen, we want to do this. We want to create a look that embodies the best of the photochemical tradition, but allows us to work with the more expanded palette that is possible with a P3 display." Like, okay, let's figure out how to do that. That's what moves me. That's what really excites me, is those challenges that my clients lay on the table for me, and trying to figure out how I'm going to do that, and seeking always to be maxing out my potential so that I have the tools to deliver on those asks.
So thinking about this, maybe let's get a little bit into the job of a color scientist. Maybe let's now get a little bit deeper into the weeds of not just the color scientist, but maybe color scientist slash colorist, because you basically wear two different hats, right? In your job, and depending on what you want to do and how you do things, this is basically two different things you have to take care of. So. How would you describe those different jobs and tasks? So if you would have to compare this, maybe start a little bit about where the differences are in the jobs between colorists and color scientists, and also while you're grading things versus developing tools, for example, for those colorists. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. So thinking about the difference between a colorist and a color scientist is something I've spent far too many hundreds of hours in my career doing. And really, my exploration of the color science side of things and expanding from simply doing the job of color grading came out of necessity. Because the best analogy I can give when I think about colorists versus color scientists is, if you think about a race car driver, you have the driver, you have the operator. That's your colorist, right? They're an athlete, essentially. They're incredibly skilled at utilizing this machine to achieve an objective. And it's happening in real time, and it's very tactile, it's very intuitive. Yes, there's lots of training that goes into that, but ultimately they are performing in a time and space, right? That's the role of a colorist. That's how I like to think about it. And if you think about the color scientist side of it, that's really the engineers and the pit crew, the people who facilitate the vehicle that colorist is operating in that moment on that day. All of the million decisions and tunes and tweaks and adjustments that go into giving that operator the tool that they need to get their job done. And that tends to be two separate roles, and when we think about it in this way, it kind of makes sense. That's two really big jobs, right? Two massive jobs. The reason that I have found myself dabbling in both and becoming skilled at both, again, is really out of necessity. Because if I had a more traditional career as a colorist and I was working as a senior colorist at a large post facility, I would be supported indeed by a team of color scientists, just like the pit crew that a driver enjoys. I have spent most of my career operating outside of traditional post facilities, but fairly early on in my career, I recognized the significance of what those color science teams, what those pit crews, what those engineers were bringing to the table, what they were facilitating for that operator, for that artist. And I just couldn't resist learning about it. And I said, well, if no one is going to step in and do that for me, I guess I have to do it for myself. So it's been one of the great joys of my career to straddle between being an operator, being a colorist, and being an engineer and an image scientist, and literally building the vehicle that I'm operating and trying to build a vehicle that best supports not just my creative agenda, but more importantly, the creative agenda of my clients.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about this, because you're right there in the middle, right? So sometimes you're working with your clients on a look. You're just doing the grade, and you just do what the artists, the director or the DP are asking for, and you help them to create that art. But on the other hand, you, for example, create lookup tables or create LUTs and looks and tools to build those looks, actually, to get the color science right, and having those tools being available for you and at your disposal, because you probably don't have what you need to get that specific job done. So that said, for example, color balancing, grading, and after everything you want to do, you want to build your own tools. Talk a little bit about this, right? What does that mean, and where are the differences?
Yes, yeah. So when I think about applying color science versus providing color science, and I think about the many ways that color science supports what I do as a professional, there are a couple different aspects to that. So there's, in my color grading business, when I'm doing client-facing work, I'll often have the impulse when I'm grading something to say like, oh wait, what if I had a knob that did this that isn't currently available to me? And the rest of my team will sometimes get upset at me because I'll press pause on color grading and be like, hey, I just want to code this up really fast. I just want to see if there's any there. I want to see if there's something to this idea. And sometimes there's not, but sometimes there is. And that's really cool. So that's an example of the color science supporting my color grading practice in a quite direct way. The other aspect of what I do as a professional that I just enjoy it's one of my favorite parts of what I do, is I offer color science as a service, and really specifically creative color science as a service. So in the same way that I recognized it fairly early on in my career, like, okay, wow, not only do I need to develop the skills of a colorist if I want to play on a level field with the colorists who I admire at these big facilities, I also need to have really good color science supporting me, just like those artists do. I've realized that that was not a unique problem to me. This is a challenge that confronts boutique post facilities, certainly independent operators, who may be cultivating their skills as a driver, as an operator, as a colorist, but who, like me, lack the color science support that is the other key ingredient that goes into the best graded images in the world. So that's the other thing that I'm really proud to offer as a professional, is color science as a service, creative color science as a service. And that is a more back and forth, less real-time process than the one I related before about maybe creating something quite quickly for myself just to try it out. That's more of a traditional client and artist relationship, where a client will come to me and say, I would like a tool that does this, or they'll say, I would like perhaps a LUT or a creative look that does that, or I'm trying to emulate the feeling of this film stock, for example. It's a very non-linear collaborative dialogue that initiates in that way. And then it's my job to work with that client, with that artist or that facility, to build them what they need, to build them a better vehicle so that they can race more effectively, to continue belaboring my driver analogy. The other image that comes to my mind a lot when I'm thinking about color grading versus color science is music and musical instruments. And I think about, okay, I'm a musician. I play the guitar, for example. Let's say that as a colorist, I play the guitar. And as a colorist, at a certain point, I got interested enough in the nuances of my instrument that I said, hey, I wonder if I could open this thing up and change something about it that would get a better sound for me. This is actually some of my favorite musicians fit this bill. Brian May from Queen famously built his own guitars and amplifiers and really sculpted his entire sound, not just with what he did with his hands, but what he did with the engineering of his tools and instruments. So I think about that, like for myself, I'm a musician who also likes to create his own instrument. But it's, as we're talking about, also what I try to now do for other musicians to say, hey, it doesn't matter what I like in my instrument, what do you like in your instrument? And what do you feel like you've never gotten to play before? What's that instrument that you wish that you could play? It's one of the most rewarding parts of what I do as a professional, to facilitate that dream for other musicians.
So you also understands the science, right? You understand the science behind the color, and I think that helps you when you then have to work on the creative side, doesn't it?
Yes, and something that has really stuck out to me throughout my career is I had a naive assumption early on in my career that was sort of like, I would almost call it a cultural value within our profession, that, okay, you need to understand a precious minimum of color science in order to be effective as a color scientist. And I can remember just early on in my career kind of wanting to pull on that sweater thread and being like, yeah, but what if I knew just a little bit more? Would that be bad? Would that be helpful maybe in some way? And when I learned a little bit more, I said, geez, that really is helpful. Like, this grade that I just did is better than the grade that I did before when I lacked that knowledge. And then I decided to go a little bit further. I'm like, well, what if I had a little bit more knowledge? And what I found over the course of my career, and now 10 years of studying color science and being mentored by some of the luminary color science figures in our field, is there doesn't seem to be an edge to that. There's simply where you choose to invest your time. But so far, no matter how much I invest in improving as a colorist or learning more about color science, they all feed into the ability to craft and sculpt better motion images. So that traditional edge of like, oh, the edge of my knowledge or the edge of general knowledge is sufficient, and past that, that's really just a waste of your time. I've simply never found that to be true.
All right, now let's talk a little about this. What is look development?
So, look development. Look development is a very slippery subject, and it's difficult to understand. And we talked earlier about how digital motion image mastering is still very much in an adolescence, and in fact, motion imaging in general isn't that old when we look at, like older disciplines such as painting, like we referred to earlier. But digital motion image mastering, we're talking about a couple decades at most. It's very, very young. And one of the areas where we have really yet to find our sea legs there is with look development. So one of my favorite principles from the photochemical tradition, which I think we can learn a lot more from than we really understand even today, where we look at how were motion images captured and reproduced in a sort of cinematic mode up until, say, the early 2000s, that was all done photochemically. And while we may not be doing things photochemically, at least in the majority of cases today, there's a lot that we can learn from the century of practice and experience that those practitioners built up during that time. One of the core principles to me that I found so resonant and applicable even in the digital realm is this idea of what you could call a print stock, or what I sometimes describe as a macro level creative transform. When I think about look development and when I think about look, I think a look is something that means 20 things to 20 people, and you really need to come up with a specific definition of like, what does look mean? Because if we're not careful, what look can end up meaning is the stuff we did to the image in between it being shot and it being shown. Well, doesn't that also just describe color grading? Like, that's not a particularly meaningful word anymore. So it kind of behooves us to give it a specific meaning that we can all agree on. And I think a very sensible specific meaning that we could hopefully all agree on would be that a look is a macro level creative transform. A look is something that does not change shot by shot. A look is something that stays the same shot by shot. And then underneath that, we make localized adjustments. That's the photochemical tradition in action. That's the way that photochemical color timers would work, where they would say, well, we're going to make a localized printer light adjustment on this shot, but it's still all going to get printed to the same print stock. And that print stock is going to have the same, not just technical character, but preferential character to render certain colors in a certain way. That to me is a look. That's the bedrock and the most important thing that once I began to understand that and crystallize that in my mind, look development became a much easier thing to tackle because it had meaning. Because I said, well, what am I developing? I'm developing a look, and a look is this and not that. Now, when I think about look development and what goes into that, if you think about that definition and we, like run with that for a minute, let's say that I'm getting that somewhat correct, that that's a reasonable definition, the rules kind of change there. A macro level creative transform is a very different thing than a localized adjustment that makes a shot look good. So the rules and the tools and the language and the grammar change when we're talking about look development. There are things that work great that are actually the best thing to do on an individual shot basis that don't work for a look development. Easy example, my favorite subject in the field of color science is middle gray. How is middle gray captured and traveled through an imaging pipeline and ultimately reproduced? One simple example that I think about with look development, generally, unless it is explicit and intentional and being done in a photometric form, we don't want to move middle gray in a look. When we're grading shots, we'll move middle gray all day. I don't care if my client wants me to trim it by 1/3 of a stop and that's what we think looks good for that shot. Awesome, that's exactly what we should do. But for a macro level creative transform, moving exposure up and down, moving middle gray up and down is inherently problematic because then that's going to be applied across all 2,000 shots in the timeline, and the likelihood that that will be what all 2,000 of those shots need, or even what most of them need, is basically zero. So that's one simple example of how the rules change in subtle but significant ways when we're talking about color grading versus look development. They're similar. We're still aimed at an artful reproduction, a preferential reproduction of the image, but the things that work well for color grading don't work well for look development, and vice versa.
Wow, I learned so much every time I sit here and doing the interviews, Well, I think I'm such a busy person. I'm always just creating those questions, so I watch Creators in Motion, or I'll just go through the questions and then I get all the answers so I don't have to go through school. I'm just kidding, but actually it's always great to learn. So it's a perfect description. You absolutely nailed it. So you explained the look development, but now the opposite would be to create the looks, right? I mean, what would you do in tool development then?
So if we think about, I'll give you one of my favorite quips that I realized about myself at a certain point in my career. I've always known that I love making things. I love making stuff, right? There's something I love even more than making stuff, and that's making stuff that makes stuff. That's what tool development is all about. So if we're talking about look development is about, like I'm going to cook you a finished dish. Now we're getting into our food analogies. So look development is about creating a finished dish, right? Like, okay, what would you like? You want a hamburger? Do you want, like some fried rice? Do you want a burrito? What are you interested in? And I'm going to go back into the kitchen and try to create exactly what you asked me for. Tool development is more about the kitchen itself. Like what kitchen would you like to walk into the next time you want to create something? And that can be on a shot-by-shot basis, so I can create a tool for you that allows you to grade shots better. I can also create a tool for you that allows you to develop looks in a more creatively advantageous way. So there's even different aspects of tool development itself, but tool development is all about looking at what's the math, what are the operations, what are the ways that we are taking this RGB image in and producing a new RGB image, and can I expose a different set of sliders, a different set of math to the end user that feel intuitive and that consistently produce the results that they want in a form that is not already available to that operator. Because of course we have great color grading software in a variety of forms today in post-production and in motion imaging, but the fact is that it's one of the core creative considerations of motion imaging to think about what is the math that I'm applying here, and it's one of my favorite things to do to think up for myself as well as for my clients. What are the tools, what are the knobs, what are the adjustments, what's the math that we haven't thought of yet, and that might be interesting creatively to give the colorist access to.
So thinking about all the stuff we talked about and lookup tables, LUTs, maybe starting with some simpler stuff for our audience. So what is the basic definition, or what would be the basic definitions and properties of those LUTs, of those lookup tables? I mean, what are they doing just in a nutshell? What is that? What's a LUT?
So when it comes to LUTs, LUTs are actually much easier to understand than we generally think. LUTs are, as most of us probably know, a lookup table. That's all it means. And a lookup table in the same sense that if you remember in elementary school where you had your multiplication tables and you could look at, okay, if I have 3 and I'm multiplying it by 3, I'll get a 9. That's a lookup table. It's just saying for this input, give me that output. It's all in the world a lookup table is. That's the good news and that's the bad news. Lookup tables are not smart. Lookup tables are not dynamic. They're just a big long list of numbers. And in fact, I think it's very illuminating to open up a LUT as a text file and see how literally true that is. It's just numbers. There's no code. There's nothing fancy. It's just a very long list of numbers. Okay, so that's the ground level definition of a LUT. And as we said, LUTs by that nature are dumb. They don't know anything. They just know for this input, give me that output. So it is up to the designer and the end user to collaborate to produce a LUT that does what is desired. And LUTs can come in a couple different forms. LUTs can be technical in nature. I can have a LUT that takes a log camera curve and linearizes it, for example. That would just be a technical LUT. There's only one correct way to do that and any number of incorrect ways to do that. A LUT can be creative in nature. So a lot of the things we've already talked about when it comes to look development, a LUT can be a really excellent vehicle for a look. And that's something that might travel in between grading systems. That's something that might travel from colorist A to colorist B. That's something in my case that can travel from my studio and into the studios of all the people who make use of the LUTs that I offer up for other colorists to take advantage of. That's a really handy way to transmit a developed look from system A to system B. That would be a creative LUT that is manipulating the image on a preferential basis and that there's no explicitly right or wrong way to do. It's just, do you like the thing that this thing does to your image? If you do, great. If you don't, then you probably shouldn't use it. And the last category that I tend to think of when it comes to LUTs would be a hybrid LUT, where you have a creative component, like we just talked about, as well as a technical component. This is the type of LUT that we are most accustomed to using on set, for example, where if we have a so-called show LUT, it's doing two jobs. It's taking the camera color space and transforming that into the color space of our display, say Rec 7 or 9, but it's also imparting some creative character. It's also showing us the creative intent, the ultimate sort of rendering that we plan to have for this image when it gets into the color grade and into post-production. So there's different categories and different types of LUTs, but if designer and end user can collaborate, and if both of those role players are competent and skilled at their job, then the LUT itself is not the issue. It's an issue of who's on either end of that LUT, and is it being applied skillfully and in the proper context or not.
Yeah, I think this is great. I mean, yeah, I think this gets us more into the real thing here about discussion of color management, right? And because you need them to know your color management, and you need to know and understand what your color management really can do, right? So you can do the job well, or you know which knobs to turn, you know, and all those kind of things. I mean, there are also different ways of having color management being set up. For example, you were mentioning from set to post, color decision lists, CDLs, for example, that make sure that something is tracked, you know. And from the creative decision that's already on set, made maybe by the DIT or by a colorist on set, and then using LUTs or ACEs as a pipeline. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Maybe let's talk a little bit about the color management in a pipeline in the production, and how those kind of looks and the kind of creative decisions are being applied.
Color management is one of my favorite things to talk about and to think about, really from a creative point of view. You know, the color science of it can be fascinating as well, but many of us are too quick to disregard the creative, the visual impact of our choices when it comes to color management. And color management is at its foundation, a very simple concept. All that color management is about is taking what the camera saw and transforming it into what our display can show. Because in 2022, for the most part, those two things won't agree. There are historical instances where maybe you're going out and you're shooting, again for the nightly news, and your camera is indeed shooting the same exact color space that it's going to go to air, and in between all you need is a bit of color correction because there's no change in color space. It's all one color space image from capture all the way through. Wouldn't it be nice if things were that simple? That's not the world that we live in today. So that's, in a nutshell, all the color management is doing. Just taking what the camera saw, transforming it into what the display can show, and we're doing that using color science, not just blindly feeling our way through it. So when we think about it in that sense, it's like, well, that's relatively simple. That doesn't seem so hard to grasp. But what's fascinating is all of the attending complexity that comes into play with color management, which is why you end up with different systems, such as ACES, such as Resolve Color Management, such as Baselight's TCAM system, all of these different ways of making that journey from what the camera saw to what the display can show, all of which are supposed to be objective and scientifically rigorous. And yet, if you run the same image from the same camera through an equivalent pipeline, through any of the systems that I just mentioned, you'll get a different image. Well, what gives with that? How does that work? If it's supposed to be objective and scientific, isn't there one right answer and any number of wrong answers? Turns out that's not the case, because when we are thinking about color management, and especially about modern cinema cameras, the challenge is that modern cinema cameras can capture more than even the very best display can show. So the consideration comes into play of how are we going to pack the dynamic range and the color volume of what was captured into the display and sort of address the limitations of that display. And that's actually a good form of the problem. That's a much better problem to have than, oh, all we captured was this little tiny dynamic range and color volume that now we have to stretch out to fill the capabilities of the display. That's a good form of the problem, but it is still a problem. We have to figure out how to do that. And the reason we see these different reproductions in different systems is because different engineers, different color scientists have chosen to address the problem in different ways. They have different agendas, they have different tools, they have different backgrounds, they have different biases in play, and all of those end up informing the only thing that I care about as a colorist, which is that end reproduction. And the other thing that I'm really passionate about that only became clear to me after I began working in color management is you look at, oh, okay, well, the difference between color management system A and color management system B. And you go, okay, so those do indeed end up netting a different image. Well, can't I just grade through that? Well, if you had, say you are using color management system B, but you prefer color management system A, well, can't I just match this to that? Well, if you had that as your reference point, maybe, you wouldn't be able to do it as quickly as if you were just working in that system. But the even bigger problem is that you generally don't have that reference point. That color management system, the only way color management works for artists like me is if you can assume that it is functional at its foundation. If you're having to second guess it and try to bend it into doing something that other than it gives you by default, that's not a very good color management framework for you. So my point here is that when it comes to color management, that foundation is going to bias every decision that you make from that point forward. And if you get a contrastier rendering in color management system B, even if you try to fight it shot by shot, you're either going to end up with a higher contrast image or you're going to end up with an inconsistent image because you're trying to fight it at every turn. So these things matter. It's not just a question of like, it gets me close enough and then I can grade my way through the rest of it. That foundation defines the heights that you will reach in your color grade. And a better foundation means that you can reach higher and accomplish more for your client, which is, of course, what I'm in the business of.
So before we move on, maybe let's talk a little bit about camera formats, right? I was pretty impressed by how you put together your master classes and also your shows, because you teach a lot about exactly those kind of basics. If you really want to think about it, it's kind of very important information and knowledge you need, right? Because if, for example, a very good video about the new Arri camera, right? I thought that was absolutely amazing. The color management of the new Arri camera and the approach Arri was taking. And I think this is, I mean, that's what people want to know, right? When they work with color, right? So when you look at all those differences in cameras, sensors, OETFs, right? And camera formats, how important is that to do a good job as a colorist, to know all those kind of things?
One of the things that I enjoy most about sort of like donning different hats regularly in my professional practice, you know, like this morning I might be a colorist and this afternoon I might be a color scientist. One of the things that I enjoy about that is kind of leaning into it and really embodying those different roles and embracing them at whatever intervals I'm in them. So, for example, as a colorist, I can be really hard on my color scientist because my color scientist is me. And I can say, I don't care about the camera, give me an image to grade. Give me an image to grade that up to the limitations of what was captured feels the same, regardless of what the mode of capture was, and regardless of where the destination display is. So a lot of what I find to be advantageous about color management is that up to the limitations of what was actually captured. So if information wasn't captured in camera, if the dynamic range of camera A didn't capture as much as the dynamic range of camera B, I can't do anything about that. No color management framework can overcome that. But up to that limitation, I should have a calibrated experience as the operator, as the artist that says, hey, if you want to push it 5 stops, if the information's in there up until you hit that limit, pushing it, turning that knob is going to feel the same, whether it was an Airy or a Red or an iPhone. That's the sort of like challenge that I give, that Cullen the colorist gives to Cullen the color scientist. Hey, figure this out for me. I don't want to hear about color science. I want to make beautiful images, you know? And that's one of the fun things, again, about getting to don these different hats, is that it allows me to lean more into being a creative colorist when that's the mode that I'm in, and further into being a color scientist when that's the mode that I'm in. So I would say from the colorist POV, you either can become a hybrid like I am and be a colorist as well as a color scientist, or in an ideal world, you would be relying on a color science team or a color science collaborator and sort of giving your order and saying, hey, like, I would like you to cook me up a color management framework that allows me to accomplish this, or a system that allows me to do that. And that for me is a big one when we talk about color management and various cameras. I want things up to the limitation of what the camera was capable of capturing. I want everything to be aligned so that I'm not grading cameras, I'm grading scenes. And I'm not grading displays, I'm grading scenes.
Well, speaking of camera formats, though, I was thinking, what's captured by the cameras, right? You mentioned also in the past you saw and talked about deceiving nature of ISO in modern sensors. And I think there was also a very interesting topic you talked about in some of your videos, and the challenges of true stimulus capture with RGB balancing, the needs of CIE coverage, and against the attending problems of virtual colors, for example. So these are a lot of different, very technical parts, but very important ones that probably decide about the quality of the final program you're putting out and you help to put out as a colorist and interpreter for your director and for your DP. So that said, can you talk a little bit about what it means that, and to practice this kind of person that helps to get that vision across with all that technical details that are important?
Yes, absolutely. So when it comes to, let's talk about ISO for a minute. ISO is such a fascinating subject and a great example of something that I can contribute value in that area the earlier in the process that I'm engaged as the creative colorist. If you've already shot your images, then you generally don't need to hear me talk about ISO unless we're talking about your next project, because you've already set your ISO wherever you set it, and it was either perfect or terrible or somewhere in between, right? But if we can talk about ISO before you go out and shoot, some of the things that I can help you understand from my perspective as a color scientist and also a colorist who's graded lots and lots of images that were ISO'd under different assumptions and at different points, is I can help you understand that ISO isn't just about noise. So when we think about, oh, well, you don't want to take the ISO too far because it's going to create noise, it's not just that. If you think about an example I've seen so many times on smaller independent films, okay, well, we're shooting night exteriors and we don't have all the firepower in the world. We don't have all the lighting units that we might want to have. So we get everything off the truck that's available, and then we crank the ISO to 1600 or 3200 and we drive it up. And we say, yeah, I know there's going to be a little bit of noise in there, but it's an acceptable compromise because we couldn't get a larger lighting package. It's not just about that noise. When you set your ISO, you are actually biasing your dynamic range away from your shadows in this case. So when you think about a night exterior shot, what would be the most important area of your dynamic range to preserve if you had to pick shadows or highlights? Probably shadows, right? Because there's so much shadow in a night exterior. So by driving your ISO up, you have less dynamic range below your middle exposures, if that makes sense. So oftentimes, when we drive ISO up or when we drop it down, it's actually the exact wrong thing for the image. Even though it's perfectly sensible that we would do it, it's understandable why we would do it in that situation, we want to find a better solution than that, because you're going to end up starving the image in exactly where it needs more life. So ISO is not just about noise, it's about distribution of dynamic range, to put it simply. So when you drive your ISO up, you are starving yourself of low-end dynamic range. When you drive your ISO down, you are starving yourself of high-end dynamic range. And ISO, interestingly, can also, in that sense, be a creative tool. You can actually think about, all right, at my nominal neutral position of my ISO, if that's giving me equal distribution of my dynamic range, so half my dynamic range is below my exposure point, half my dynamic range is above, maybe you do want to use it as a creative tool and explicitly say, no, I want to get more of the dynamic range assigned to capturing and holding the nuances of my shadows, for example. That's a totally valid creative agenda that you can only have if you've been exposed to these ideas. And honestly, if you're working with someone who is your creative advocate for your post-production pipeline. I know a couple of cinematographers who are particularly astute about these things, who I've learned from, but in general, cinematographers, just like color scientists and colorists, they got plenty to do as it is. So that you really need collaborators and advocates in most cases in order to start to be turned on to these creative choices that are available to you. Otherwise, it's something that ends up going unconsidered, and we end up going with conventional wisdoms or with the things that manufacturers suggest to us, all of which may lead us into different directions and lead us to make different choices.
Yeah, I think this is, as you said, I mean, this is especially for young filmmakers, very important message when they're trying to enter the industry and they want to do a better job, right? And maybe better work than their competitors, right? I mean, we talked about this a little bit when you talked about what should a young person take care of in the early stage of their career, right? But it's also getting a job done, right? Having a decent living, making a living off the job, right? I mean, that's also parts of your shows and videos, I think, and on your channel, on your YouTube channel, where you also help people to get that part of the business right? And I think in the early days you better learn, right, how to collaborate with everybody on set and who's operating the camera, who's operating the lights, who's doing this, who's doing that. So. Which makes a big difference in the end how the image is going to be perceived, isn't it? I mean, the earlier you can be involved in this, the better.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can, when you get collaborators involved, post-production collaborators, advocate involved earlier in the process, these are things that can be explored and tested. You know, if we work together tomorrow and we're going to go shoot you're going to go shoot a awesome new, like epic thriller or something next month, and we're going to work together on the pipeline and on helping you make your exposure decisions. You don't have to take my word for anything. I'm not going to tell you, well, where you really need to put your ISO is 1600 or whatever. What we can do is test, and then you can see for yourself, okay, first of all, does this make a difference, or is this guy Cullen crazy? You can actually see the difference that it makes, and then you can make from a creative POV with full sort of survey of the available options, the choice, and say, oh, that wins, hands down. If you don't have those options laid out tidily in front of you, and you don't have that creative advocate, that post-production collaborator selected and have that relationship set up, you don't get the opportunity to do that, and you end up making creative compromises that you're not aware of until far, far too late in the process.
So let's talk a bit about the color side of things. We talked about ISO, dynamic range, and how you would better know through some camera testing and having people that operate the camera how to do it and how to get the best results out of your camera. We talked about this. But then maybe let's talk about the color side, where we talk about the challenges and problems of visual colors, like example, making them match with the CIA horseshoe coverage. I mean, and the how human beings actually perceive color, and how you also probably have virtual colors that you probably, well, have to handle or have to work with or have to ignore. So what is it? What is this all about?
Yeah, so we can think about the color side of things for a minute here and think about, in the same way that we've talked about traveling a particular exposure level from what was decided upon in camera all the way out to a display so that that holds, so that creative intent is preserved. We can think about colors the same way, because really the fundamental nature of what we're trying to do is to accurately and artfully reproduce scene colors. We want the final rendered image to look like it did when we were standing there, but we also want to have the ability to manipulate and enhance and elevate that per our creative intent. But if we think about that baseline consideration of reproducing what was captured, one of the challenges that arises is when we think about color gamut. When most of us think about color gamut, you can probably visualize that CIE horseshoe that shows here's all the colors that are colors at all as far as human beings are concerned. These are all the colors that we see as color when those particular wavelengths hit our eyeballs. And you can think about, those familiar triangles that get drawn within or around that horseshoe that demonstrate here's the portion of that horseshoe that Rec 709 is capable of reproducing, or here's the portion of that horseshoe that S gamut 3 is capable of capturing, whatever the particular gamut may be. Those triangles are used to describe the portion of that spectral locus, the portion of that horseshoe that either a device is capable of capturing or of reproducing. And what's funny is you can think about this almost as kind of a geometry problem, because when we think about tri-stimulus imaging, which is the foundation of all motion imaging, red, green, and blue, you now have 3 points to form your triangle. That's the shape that you have to draw. So one of the challenges that manufacturers of cameras and displays and designers of color management frameworks have begun to think about in a more nuanced way is, how do we draw a triangle that encompasses all of that spectral locus, all of that horseshoe if possible, but with a minimum of what are called virtual colors, meaning wavelengths that are outside of that horseshoe. Because if you look at just the challenge, if I tell you, hey, I want you to take 3 points and draw me a triangle that perfectly encloses that horseshoe. That's easy. You can do that. But when you do, you'll notice that there are significant regions within that triangle which rest outside of the spectral locus. And if that data is being captured by the original imaging medium, you've now got virtual colors, colors that are essentially meaningless, that are data in your camera negative, and now you got to do something with those. Well, what do you do with them? What's the sensible thing to do with a virtual color? It's not so easy to answer that question, and it really creates a material issue for how we shepherd that image on through the pipeline and what we do with those colors. So we're starting to think about this, as I said, in a bit more of a nuanced way, and that's why if we look at, say, the new Alexa 35 camera and the way that they are addressing the challenge, they've actually on paper scaled the gamut back from area-wide gamut 3 in the interest of getting a large volume of the spectral locus encompassed, but getting fewer virtual colors, which we've learned by trial and error, again, in kind of the early adolescent years of digital motion imaging, of like cinematic image reproduction, color management, all those things. We've sort of learned the hard way, like, well, having a triangle that perfectly encloses the spectral locus is not sufficient, because we end up with all of these messy edge cases that we then have to, or with this messy edge data, I should say, that we have to do something with, and it turns out there's not that many good things that we can do with that data.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Absolutely. And so from that point of view, I mean, ACES, for example, is one of those systems, right? Where you originally was designed as an archiving system, input transforms and output transforms and those kind of things, right? And make sure that the original source is preserved, right? Looking at this, speaking of those systems, maybe let's talk a little bit about your job as a color scientist and customers you're taking care of as a consultant, because you're not just a color scientist and a colorist, but you're also very often work as a consultant, right? So you provide support and consultations to those customers, like, for example, 6P Color and TBD Post in Austin, Texas, for example. Those are customers. Let's talk a little bit about this. What are you doing with them, and what are those specifics, and what are the important things with your daily work?
So one of my favorite clients who I'm currently working with is a company called 6P Color. 6P Color, 6P stands for 6 primaries, and the core premise behind 6P Color is to break out of the triangle that we were talking about a moment ago, that traditional triangle of red, green, and blue that we use to describe a subdomain or a region of the CIE horseshoe or of the spectral locus. 6P is about taking that, what we could essentially describe as a geometry problem. How do I draw a shape with 3 points that encompasses this much but doesn't encompass any of that? It's about taking that geometry problem and expanding the degrees of freedom within it. So if I were to tell you, for example, okay, now I want you to draw me a shape that perfectly contours, aligns, hugs that spectral locus without exceeding any of its boundaries, and I told you, now I'm going to give you 4 points with which to do that instead of 3, you could do a better job of it, right? Because now you can draw a different shape that gets more of the interior and less of the exterior of that spectral locus. And even more so if I were to give you a 5th point or a 6th point, hence 6P. So 6P is really in the business of expanding color gamut, of expanding the color gamut that is available to creatives in terms of the end image without necessarily extruding out into areas beyond the spectral locus, which are not useful, as we've said. So that's kind of the core idea behind 6P, and my role within the group at the moment that I'm really enjoying playing is to act as a sort of a bridge between the technical considerations of how a system like that could be designed, devised, and implemented, and the actual hands-on implementation of how it's going to be ultimately leveraged and used by creators, by colorists, by filmmakers in general, and thinking about how do we make that a seamless transition so that all I'm offering you is more colors, but everything else feels the same. You don't have to adapt in any other way, except that you have a larger palette at your disposal. So that's the idea with 6P Color, is that we have a broader canvas to work with that, similar to HDR, we may or may not want to use every inch of for every frame in every project, but when you have a broader canvas, then you have a greater degree of creative freedom.
Yeah, that's a very interesting concept. I mean, thinking about this, maybe can you go a little bit into the detail? How does it work? I mean, the camera is capturing RGB, and then they have a 6P system, yeah, right? How does that transfer to the camera, to their system, and back to the monitor? Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yes. So one of the things that's really interesting when we start to talk about this multi-primary idea of 6 primaries or 5 or 4, however many we're discussing, it's like, at what point in an imaging pipeline does that get introduced? At what points is it advantageous? And it turns out there's more than one answer to that, and it would be really fun, for example, to think about potentially an imaging medium that has more than 3 photosites, more than 3 sensitivities of photosite. Maybe that would be interesting. At the moment, the sort of initial phase of 6P is focused on the reproduction side. So to put it in sort of layman's terms, the idea is that you can take a scene, you can take a graded archival master, for example, where you've got original scene data, it's been graded, but it has yet to have a display transform imparted to it. And you can actually move that into the same domain that we are looking at when we look at that CIE horseshoe, where you are normalizing for luminance. Remember, that's the missing dimension when we look at a chromaticity diagram. We don't see luminance, we just see X and Y color coordinates, little x and little y. You can actually move into that YXY domain into the image so that everything is just represented by chromaticity coordinates. And then at the point of reproduction, if you have a display with more than 3 emitters, you have a display with a larger gamut that can reproduce more of that graded archival master than a display with, for example, only 3 emitters could. So it's, in layman's terms, essentially an expansion of end reproduction gamut along the lines of, when we make that jump from like a Rec 7 or 9 to a P3 reproduction, like, wow, look at all that extra cyan, which is really where you feel the difference of P3. Similar type of scenario that 6P is in the midst of exploring right now, like, well, if we have a 4 or a 5 or a 6 emitter system, what can that do to expand the potential gamut just on the display side? And by moving through that vehicle of the YXY system, you can simply take graded scene data and leverage a larger color gamut on the reproduction end.
Yeah, another one is TBD Post in Austin, Texas, right? They all do all those sorts of work like commercials and feature, and they do even editorial sound, right? They're not just doing the picture, but they do sound as well. They have the whole spiel of what we want to do in the media production. So what are the things you are doing with TBD?
So TBD Post is another one of my absolute favorite color science clients who I'm working with. And with them, I'm really in the business, as we talked about earlier, of building instruments for musicians. So these are some of my favorite colorists working in the business. And they reached out to me and they said, hey, we want different tools. We want better tools. We want different looks. We want to have a different car to drive essentially as colorists. You know, we like the overall color grading system that we are working in, but we want to have different tools and we want to have different looks and like capabilities available to us as creatives. So my work with them is really about that creative dialogue of like, that's interesting, tell me more. What would you like to see? Are you into film emulation? Are you into really, like high contrast, like HDR, like full contrast reproduction? What are you into as a colorist? And of course, we're talking about more than one colorist, so there's more than one answer there. But my work with them is all about facilitating their ability to master images in a better fashion, to better serve their clients that they're working with in turn, and for them to have a more liberating and a more sort of dialed in palette for their creative agenda than is available to them through the stock tools of their grading system. So it takes lots of different forms, but we've had an absolute blast this year really developing and building out a number of different tools and transforms that allow them to get closer to that sooner, more efficiently, more consistently.
So let's talk a little bit about your the short film you worked on, Feeling Through. It was a short film that was a 2021 Academy Award nominee. I was looking it up, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's about a deaf-blind person, an actor actually, and it was a very important part of the director's vision to get that feeling across, right? And you were part of that team to make that work. So maybe talk a little bit about your work on Feeling Through, and how did this start and end up looking so great? And what were the hassles and obstacles you had to go through to get to a point that it looks as great as it does now?
Yeah, so Feeling Through is an example of a film and a client relationship that it's almost hard to rewind and think about what it was as opposed to what it has become, which is, as you said, a really exceptionally beautiful film and one of my most rewarding color grading client relationships with the director, Doug. Just really, really loved what that film was able to do, and I'm such a fan of the film and such a fan of Doug's. But it's funny, when I do try to rewind, Feeling Through was just a film that I was slated to grade on a particular Tuesday a couple of years ago. And of course, when you're at that stage, you have no idea. I had maybe watched the film down once, so I knew it was good, but I had very little context and certainly no notion of what it would go on to achieve. It was just another grade. But what stands out to me about Feeling Through was that was fairly early in my journey as a colorist of really starting to place the color science side of things in a proper perspective, and really starting to realize, like, wow, if I can nail my creative color science, if I can have my images flowing through an imaging pipeline that feels really good to me and feels really good to my client, if I can have that foundation in place, I might not need to work that hard as a colorist. I might be able to take my foot off the gas a little bit as a colorist and just let that pipeline do its job. This was sort of early in my days of Feeling Through that discovery. And I remember very distinctly, I think we might have had 4 hours to grade the film. It wasn't a long time. Doug and Eugene, the cinematographer, came in, and I was just sort of like labbing out this idea. So all I did was I prepped a good imaging pipeline that had both a technical and a creative component to it, just a sort of initial feeling, an initial starting point for the film. And I made a suggestion. I said, hey, can we just play this down? I've only watched it one time. I'd love to see it. I'd like to just press play and watch it, and we can all sort of mentally note where we'd like to see this go, what feels good, what feels terrible, and just get that feeling for it, but without commentary, without pausing. So we press play, we watch it down, and I'm making little notes here and there of like, oh, we could knock that down, or we could build that up, or we could cool that off, or whatever. And I could tell Doug and Eugene were doing the same thing. But we finished the play down, and my impression before any of us spoke was like, wow, this film looks pretty darn good. Like without really, I hadn't done any color grading yet. It was just a good pipeline. And that was the reaction that I got from Doug and Eugene as well. So they said, oh wow, so what camera LUT did you use there? Well, I said, well, it's not a camera LUT, it's a custom pipeline that I built, based on what I thought would serve your story well, what I thought you might like. And they said, we love it. That looks really, really good. Let's go back through and now make some good fundamental adjustments. And it was all very photometric work from there, and really a lot of it was driven by Eugene's notes about what she wasn't able to fully do on set or wanted to enhance even further, of like, hey, let's control that area of the frame that's not so important and knock it down, or this exposure feels a little bit thin, let's open it up just a little bit, those little small adjustments. But we worked very globally, very simply, and we really trusted that overall pipeline that we used. So for me, it was a success in terms of the color grade. I'm proud of the color grade, but the foundation of what made that really nicely shot movie work really well in the way it was mastered really had as much to do with that creative color science foundation that we were working with. So that was a really big light bulb moment for me. It was one of the first jobs where I had the courage, or maybe just the curiosity, to say, like, what if I didn't grade quite so much, quite so quickly? And I just put this into a pipeline and spent a little more time fussing over that pipeline, and then just press play and let the client drive and tell me what they feel like is missing or what they want to see. And I thought it was a really, really rewarding experience, and a fun one to work through with those clients.
So from what you normally teach in your classes, right, you pretty often are also talking about the potential grade and the sweet spot, right? Finding the sweet spot. It's a matter of how much we already discussed about how early you get into the stage of the project, right? And working from set to post, from pre-production probably even. But how would you describe this from a practical standpoint? What are the practical tips here for young filmmakers and future colorists? How do they get into the sweet spot? How do they work to achieve that sweet spot?
There's a really special moment that happens for me in color grading that requires a lot of the things we've already talked about. You need a good imaging pipeline. You need a good look. You need to be generally sitting with a client and have some trust and some rapport and an understanding of what it is that they're looking for. But when you have those prerequisites in place, there's a really, really special moment that happens for me when I'm grading, where just by working two very simple global operators, namely, where's my exposure and where's my color balance? How much red, how much green, how much blue in a given image? It's a really special thing that happens for each of those adjustments. It's what I call a sweet spot. You just are turning left, turning right on your exposure, and you go, there it is. That's it. And it's special to me because color grading is absolutely fraught with uncertainty. And there are a million ways that you could grade any one image. There's any number of ways to do one thing. There's any number of directions creatively you could take it. So that aha moment of like, nope, it's here. It's not an inch there, it's not an inch there, it's right here. It's a really special feeling, and I think it is the maybe ultimate payout of all of this table setting and diligence that I'm talking about, of building your craft, of owning your craft, of continuing to max out your potential, of setting the table properly for your image and getting all those things into the right position. There's just that magic moment where you're working exposure left and right, and it's not just idiosyncratic or personal to me. Everyone in the room can feel it. You can practically hear it in the room where you go, there it is. That's it right there. And then the same exact thing with balance. You're like, oh, there's kind of a sweet spot where like colors feel separated, warm feels really warm, cool feels really cool. Everything just feels natural but artful and beautiful. That's generally kind of the description that I would give of it, but in both of those cases, it's a palpable this, not that, here, not there thing. It's what I call the sweet spot, and it's one of my favorite sort of anchors in the what can feel like a storm of color grading sometimes. You're like, all right, here we are. We're finding our way. And as you work your way through a color grade and you find that sweet spot shot after shot after shot, now you're in a position where it's like, okay, how much further do we want to go? Do we want to go into the nuance of this or that or this? But we've got the pipeline and we've got that exposure and that balance feeling really, really good. It's a magical feeling to get to that point.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I mean, that's very much, you hear this almost with every craft, right, in the filmmaking process, be it the editors or whoever is part of that, right? How do I get out of the scene? How do I get into the scene? You know, all those things. It's kind of, and what's the feeling, right? It's the sweet spot in every craft of actually this production chain and how this project actually comes to life, right? So that rings another bell here, because thinking of this, there was another project you mentioned, and it's called Early Risers. It's a TV show, a series that follows lives of American and European expats living and working in the city of Saigon, Vietnam. And I know you told me in another conversation we had that this was an entirely different approach than, for example, Feeling Through as a production. So maybe talk a little bit about that work and why, and where was it different from what the other works were?
I'd love to. So another project that really stands out to me in recent memory is one that I've just really enjoyed grading is this TV series called Early Risers. So Early Risers was shot on location in Vietnam, and it was shot, frankly, just really, really well. It's one of those projects that comes in and it's almost a little anxiety inducing when you see it, because you're like, oh wow, it already looks really good. So I've got an onus not only to make sure I don't harm anything, but what am I going to do? What am I going to bring to the table to match what this amazing production team brought to the table? And what I really loved about that experience was it sort of was a fresh reminder for me of like, you know, whatever you bring me, I can take it that much further. So because the negative that they brought me was so beautifully exposed, shot on these beautiful lenses, and as I said, the Alexa camera, and it's night exteriors that are really healthily exposed. And so as a result, because, you know, think of it this way, on a smaller independent film, a lot of what I end up doing with, say, the night exteriors, let's say this is a small independent film shot night exteriors. What I'm end up doing a lot of the time with those night exteriors is just trying to sort of nurse them to health, if that makes sense, because they are limited by their grip and electric package, they're limited by time, and they're doing the absolute best they can for the project on very finite resources. And in those cases, I love that challenge, and I really enjoy trying to figure out, like, all right, how are we going to make this feel healthy, clean, legible, all the things that are important for any image. But when you have something like Early Risers, it's like, nope, exposure is already super healthy. They nailed it. And it's not because they're like wide open on the glass and the image is starting to break going through the lens. Everything is kind of there. It just means that instead of figuring out, okay, how am I going to get it healthy, we figure out how am I going to get this image to absolutely thrive. And because there's information in the shadows, which we talked about earlier, where like, oh, the ISO clearly hasn't been cranked up to 3200 because there's dynamic range down in there. It just meant that I was able to go that much further, and instead of figuring out, okay, how are we going to make this image legible but not noisy, instead we were looking at it and going, what can we do to really bring all of that beautiful texture and nuance and localized variation in the shadows to even bigger life? And that's what we spent the whole project on doing, is just going, I mean, it already looks good. What can we do to push that even further? How can we, you know, like embolden that vision even more? So to me, it was just a really great object lesson that when you get a better looking image to start with, it's not a question of like, oh, how am I going to match? What I actually found was, oh, it's easier to match, and then I can spend more time offering creative suggestions and making value adds, as opposed to sort of trying to resuscitate a half living image, if that makes sense. Another thing I was super impressed about is the short film, The Barefoot Empress. And it's a short nonfiction film. And it's about a 96-year-old woman in Kerala village in India pursuing her lifelong dream of getting an education that was denied to her her entire life. And then she's there, 96 years old, with all those little other girls
like in first, second grade, which is heartbreaking. It's so beautiful to see this, and just watching this was a pleasure. But also looking at the material and looking at the location that was where this was all shot, I think it's very interesting to hear how you approached that, because I think that was an entirely different way of working with that, right? Maybe just give us a little bit of insights here, what happened there.
Yeah, so Barefoot Empress, another really, really exciting grade that I did recently that is a very unique film, obviously. It's a story that I was so moved by and so excited to get to contribute to. But it's documentary, it's nonfiction. It was shot in a very far-flung part of the world where there's not a lot of technology, not a lot of infrastructure, and it was captured using the tools that were available to the filmmaker. So it is not a story that's told with 5 IMAX cameras. You know, it's told with available cameras that were able to capture this story, and what was important was the story, not the imaging system being used to capture it. So Barefoot Empress to me was a great opportunity to take things back to basics, and a great reminder to me to keep ego out of the situation as a colorist. It's not about what I do as a colorist or about other colorists looking at my work going, oh, isn't that beautiful? Of course, that's nice when that happens, but that should never be what our work is about. And this was a reminder to me because these were fragile images. They were captured under, you know, real world conditions, and there are a lot of day exteriors, a lot of daylight, a lot of uncontrolled light, not a full high-end professional camera package. So they're fragile images. There's something almost archaeological about working with them when I think about like dusting off the bones and being sure not to disturb them. That was really the idea that I had in my mind with these images is like, how little can I do to make the image more of itself, to bring out more of that image's essence without trying to turn it into a Hollywood blockbuster, which I like to think I don't ever do, but it's a temptation I think all colorists experience of like, oh, we're gonna you know, give this my thumbprint and we're gonna make it look like, you know, a high budget Hollywood film. That would have been completely inappropriate for this subject matter, and it would have served the subject matter really poorly. So for me, it was a reminder to be humble and put story first. And again, to take a less is more approach of like, what are the small handful of things that I can do on this image or on that image to elevate it, to make it more like itself without attempting to fundamentally alter its nature, because its nature is beautiful.
No, these are great stories. That's absolutely fantastic. And I think that's the interesting part of everybody in our industry, right? So all of us, I mean, you as an artist and you as a consultant and you as a color scientist, we as Portrait Displays, as a software company, as a provider for calibration equipment, and for also having a lot of color scientists on our team, this is this intersection between art and science, right? That I think really drives it. That's so great. So there's one thing we haven't yet touched, and that was the monitoring part, right? So with all the technology and all the creative work, I mean, in the end, there's monitoring. There's a display, you need a monitor. What are the things that you think you should have in place to effectively use the tools to create art yourself, or use those tools to be a color scientist or a colorist to provide the service and to provide good work in the end so that you know what you're doing?
Yeah. You know, equipment is such a fun and tricky thing to talk about when we're talking about color grading, because most of us, I would venture, who are colorists or aspiring colorists, we've got at least a little bit of a geeky streak. You know, we're into technology. We're into the way that technology can facilitate storytelling. And if we're not careful, that can turn into a sort of unchecked appetite for latest, greatest technology. I know I have been victim of that at various points in my career, and way over invested in equipment that really wasn't being driven by need, but was being driven by my interest and appetite for that equipment, which there's nothing wrong with, except when you misassign the reasoning for purchasing equipment. If you want to purchase stuff for fun, you should, but that's different than purchasing stuff for the health of a color grading business, which is what we're talking about now. So I'm a big believer in the idea of investing in oneself as opposed to investing in equipment. Equipment all told, as an actual investment, it's not easy to invest in equipment in a way that is going to pay out. It's certainly possible and necessary, but it's far easier to invest. It's far easier for an investment in equipment to become a poor investment because equipment depreciates. Because if that equipment is not actually going to meaningfully impact your ability to deliver great images for your clients, then that's a bad investment. So I'm a big believer in this idea of minimum viability. And for me, the minimum viability, the minimum viable ingredients that I think about when it comes to, the actual hardware that we're working with as colorists, of course, you need a workstation. You need something that can run your color grading platform and something that can run it well enough that you're not constantly butting up into the limitations of the machine. So that's necessary for sure. The other thing that you need that I think does sometimes get under-discussed, you need a way to get color sciencey for a second. You need a way to get code values untampered with right out of the box. And interestingly, that's basically impossible with like the normal HDMI connection on your laptop or your workstation. You will never be able to do it because there are systems in place that are designed to improve or enhance or to manage those code values, which are all perfectly sensible for the application of getting a graphical user interface, not sensible for a colorist. A colorist needs to be able to say, I need code values unaltered, untampered, directly out to my display. So that means you need a dedicated output card of some sort that's going to take a code value and send it directly out to your monitor. And that really flows into the last thing, and probably the most important thing for me. You need an image you can trust. You need a accurate display that is not just accurate in the sense that someone tells you it's accurate, and not just accurate in the sense that it has quote unquote 99% coverage of some color space, but is accurate in the sense that it is a reference display that has been produced for image mastering and that has been measured and proven to uphold the standard that it claims to uphold. Without that, that to me is really the most important thing. That's the end of the road for a professional colorist. If you can't offer that to your clients and say, hey, what I'm looking at, what you're looking at, this means something. This represents the bullseye. This represents the ideal for the standard that we are mastering for, then you really can't command maximum value for your time. And that's another big principle of mine as a colorist. I want to give max value. We talked about that earlier. And I want to get max value. I want to see an equitable exchange of value there. And having that trustworthy image at the end of your imaging signal pipeline is imperative if that's what you're serious about doing.
So, of course, I mean, you're here at Portrait Displays in Pleasanton now, at the headquarters. And so talking about an accurate display is, of course, one of the main core topics we do every day here at Portrait Displays, for example. So, of course, there's a question. How important is calibration? I mean, if you would think about it, I mean, how essential is calibration? You know, I know every time I meet people that actually think it's not that important, and it always amazes me because I think, wait a minute, I mean, you really want to trust the thing, right? But what's your point? What's your take on this very important topic? I mean, how would you take care of your display? How do you make sure that it's right, what you're looking at, that you can trust what you're looking at? Why is that so important?
Yeah, so calibration is such an important part of my color grading business, and color science for that matter. But calibration is a foundational element that if I don't have that solid foundation underneath me, I really can't do much else well or reliably or consistently on top of it. And the way that I like to think about calibration is in the context of a dartboard. So if we think about any display that we could ever look at any image on and its accuracy as represented by a dart that we throw and it hits a dartboard, okay? That maybe hits dead center of the dartboard. Maybe it barely even hits the dartboard. Maybe it's right on some edge of the dartboard, right? Any display that we can think of, we're going to simplify its accuracy in terms of where on the dartboard does that dart land when we throw it. And if you think about it for a moment, if you have your display that you're mastering on and it happens to plot way at the lower right-hand corner of the dartboard, that's just the innate display and what it does, and you either have never measured it so you don't know, or you say to yourself, who cares? What's the big deal? It's on the dartboard, what does it matter? Then think about what happens after we do our thing as colorists. it has to go out there into the big bad wide world where we have precisely zero control over anything. I have no control over what you're going to look at my images on or the viewing conditions you are going to look at those images under. So sooner or later, that same image that I mastered with a display whose dart plots way there at the lower right, sooner or later, someone is going to have the perfect antithesis of my inaccurate display, whose dart plots way at the upper left of the dartboard. And if we think about the distance between those two things, meaning the potential for variation in what everyone agreed to was the image and looks great and what that viewer is seeing, the distance is one dartboard of distance, right? It covers the full range of the dartboard. If we think about a calibrated display and we take that into consideration and say, no, my display, it's a bullseye. It's dead on. That means from that point forward, anywhere else out in the big bad world where that image gets reviewed, the maximum distance from what we all signed off on as the image that we love is 1/2 of a dartboard. Now, because I'm a color scientist and I have a penchant for math, I'll emphasize that the mathematics of what I'm describing don't hold one-to-one, but the notion certainly does, that by controlling the variable that you can, your reference display, you are minimizing the maximum error that any viewer can experience. And that really is the end goal in terms of calibration, in terms of image accuracy for an image mastering professional. We want to give the best possible reproduction to the greatest number of viewers. The way we do that is with a calibrated display that has been verified to be accurate.
Yeah, right. And I think if you think about this, I mean, filmmaking is a collaborative process, right? I mean, there's not just post, there's pre-production, there's production on set, there's post-production, and all those different things. I mean, and then there's QC, and you want to have everything in place, right? And with calibration, you probably actually make sure that everybody who's part of that chain is starting to see the same thing. The vision is going to be maintained, right? In contributing anything to the production, right?
Yes, absolutely. You know, consistent viewing, consistent rendering of the image for anyone who is weighing in on and contributing guidance to the way that image gets mastered, it's so important. And you know, like one of the misconceptions that comes to mind for this, or that comes up in conversation a lot at this point, is people want to, there's sometimes the notion of, well, I'm going to give this the old car stereo test. Like, well, we're mastering in this big fancy mixing facility, but we don't really know what the music sounds like until we play it back in our car stereo. I am a very poor amateur musician, and I've got musician friends who are professionals and are very good at it, and that's something that gets discussed a lot in the context of making music. It's like, well, we got to put it in the car stereo and give it a listen before you can really hear how it sounds. We want to hear how it's going to sound out in the real world. The problem is, with music mastering as well as with image mastering, that's a misguided notion, because if it was going to be the same kind of wrong in all scenarios, that would be a sound approach. If everyone was always going to be reviewing our work on an image that was a little dim and a little pink, for example, then it would make perfect sense to review our image on a display which was a little dim and a little pink, because now we're going to be looking at it under the same viewing conditions everyone else will be. But the whole problem, the whole challenge of accuracy, is that there's dispersion in every direction from that bullseye that we just talked about. So if you are looking at a display that's a little dim and a little pink, sooner or later someone's going to look at the same image on a display that's a little bright and a little green. And now you've got the exact kryptonite for that display because you've already been biasing it in that direction. So that's the premise there, is that we want to have every stakeholder in the process reviewing an accurate image. And this isn't in ignorance of the fact that it's going to be viewed on inaccurate displays. This is actually because it's going to be viewed on inaccurate displays that we want to be buttoned up, we want to be bullseye on. That way that dispersion is minimized for all of the other displays it's going to be viewed on.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, all of this. That sounds pretty logical. I mean, that's how it should be. So I think about this, there comes the situation into my mind where I saw a show, I can't remember which channel that was, but they talked about a very dark episode of a show. It was either Game of Thrones or something like this. But the interesting thing was that a big discussion erupted about how should the grading being done? Should it be really done under reference conditions, and then the people at home don't have the same conditions, and so of course people are frustrated? Or should we actually stick to the idea that there's a reference and that we know that reference, and this is kind of a known formula that we can use, because then we can be sure that we know what we put out there, right? Maybe talk a little bit about this. What's your take on how should content be created? And when we look at the reference room environment, for example, there is D65 bias light behind the screen. There is a 5-nit environment. There is, according to the BT2100 recommendation, for example, there is also the way on how the display should be calibrated and all those other things. If we look at this, preserving creative intent is a real true lens to living room solution, right? So what's your take on this, and what do you think is important, why we have those standards in place?
Yeah, I absolutely agree in that with that lens to living room idea that we preserve things through. And the reality is we're in a more challenging time than, like I always think about the work of Gordon Willis, ASC in general, and specifically a film like The Godfather. I'm sure there were people who felt that The Godfather was too dark, or there might even be, like I remember in film school, my classmates watching The Godfather on the DVD or whatever home viewing setup we had at the time, and going like, I can't even see that. Like, are you serious? Why does everyone love this film? And I can remember even then teachers saying like, well, do yourself a favor. You're in one of the largest filmmaking cities in the world. This is in Los Angeles. Pay attention to the revival theaters and keep your eyes peeled for the next time there's a print running of The Godfather. Go watch The Godfather in the theater and let me know if you still feel that way. And invariably, you would go and view that image in the exact context that it was designed for, and you'd go, wow, that's not only not bristling me anymore, it's really beautiful, and I love the creative decision that was made to place the exposures at that point in the tone scale. That's one example of something that we can't quite do anymore, because I can tell you, well, you need to black out your living room. Maybe you're able to do that, maybe you're not, but I can't necessarily instruct you to create your own ideal viewing experience, nor can I tell you, well, just go check it out at your local cinema for an episode of TV, for example. So I do get the frustration when viewers watch an image and they don't like the rendering or they don't feel they can see it. Ultimately though, I feel that like my whole profession is tethered to creative intent. I'm obsessed with creative intent. I'm obsessed with protecting, enhancing, and elevating creative intent. So I think at the end of the day, if you are not enjoying what you're seeing in an episode of Game of Thrones, probably the most constructive thing to say is, I don't like Game of Thrones. Because you have to, if you're going to enjoy work that is created, fictional work, creative work that is produced by an author, you have to give that author a certain amount of latitude to be the author. Otherwise, you are democratizing authorship of images in a way that, we tend to use democracy and democratization as a positive term, and in many contexts it is, but we can't democratize authorship in that way. We don't all get to weigh in on the color grade of that episode of Game of Thrones. It makes a fun discussion, but ultimately, the authors of that show and of that image need to control that. And if you consistently feel that they're making dumb choices and it makes it a problematic viewing experience for you, then maybe that's not the show or the film for you, whatever the particular case may be.
Yeah, great. I mean, this is the analogy you came up with. I think that's exactly right? You came up with this because, it was House of Dragons, exactly, where we had the same discussion like with Game of Thrones at that time. People were complaining about it. And I think in the end, this is where consumer education comes in, right? Where your shows, even if you are providing videos and shows for professionals, I think people who are interested in quality are starting to see and watch those kind of things. We see the same with Color Matters. A lot of people are interested in this show because it gives them a much broader concept of why you should preserve creative intent. And then people are like, oh yeah, that's the way I should see it, right? So I think telling the people where they can get that information they need to understand what color is all about, I think that would be the right way to go, right? To do more education and get that education out there so people start to understand what's going on, from the retailers to the manufacturers, everybody, right?
Yeah, and you know, we've skipped over analogies for like several talking points now, so it's time to return to an analogy. Another way that we can think about this is that there are different meals that are designed to stimulate your taste buds and your senses and to give you different kinds of experience, and they're not all created equal. So it may be that you want to watch your favorite sitcom or your favorite sporting event as bright and visible and high contrast as possible, and there's of course nothing wrong with that. But it may also be that, you know, there are restaurants, for example, where if you want it without the sauce, the chef will say, no, it comes with the sauce. And there has to be room for that as well. If you don't want to patronize that restaurant, that's okay. But there does need to be room for the crafting of an experience and for a skilled creator to guide a viewer through that experience, even if it's not the same thing that they had for breakfast or what they're going to want to have for every meal for the rest of their life. There needs to be room, I really do believe, for a creator to craft an experience, and room for us as viewers to extend trust, at least to the right creators, and say, hey, if it's dim or I'm having to lean forward in my chair or I feel like I can't really hear it on the crummy speakers on the TV and I need to get a decent sound system, maybe that's for a really good reason. And maybe I need to extend a little bit of trust to this creator. There's got to be room for that.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's get back into the world of analogies, right? So it's like maybe like a sommelier, right? When it comes to wine, right? Suggesting the right glass, so to get the real flavor and the everything that comes with that specific bouquet or whatever that wine has, right? I think that's another very interesting analogy. Well, we already talked about food, so we should now talk about wine. That said, there's still someone that's guiding people through that process, through that experience, right? We see this, for example, with retailers. Calibration as a service is growing. It's becoming more and more important. Consumers are starting to ask the right questions. They're interested in better picture quality. And then there's even retailers that are calibrating those TVs with a day mode, a night mode. There are ways of fixing things and making sure that the art is going to be preserved. People start to see it the way it's supposed to be seen. I think with those people who are not interested in calibration, well, then get something else, right? Don't get your TV calibrated, whatever you want, right? But then you don't get a calibrated TV. But those people who care, they actually should get it. And I think that's a very encouraging thought, that calibration as a service now these days is so important, isn't it?
Well, I love this aspect of the conversation because there really is an analogy of if I'm trying to sell you a display and I show you a display that is hyper colorful and extremely bright, on a biological level, you are going to respond more strongly to that display than to a calibrated, accurate display, in the same way that if I take you through a drive-through right now, you're going to respond more strongly to the hyper palatable food at a fast food restaurant than you will. You're going to have a very different response and probably a less biologically extreme response to a well-crafted meal, right? But that doesn't mean that fast food is better than fine dining, nor does it mean that they need to be mutually exclusive. But there has to be room, again, for, you know, like a crafted experience. And I agree with you. I think we are finding very happily that there is appetite among consumers for like, oh wow, that is different. That is something else. And it's not just a scaled down version of the in-your-face vivid color mode that I'm used to. There's actually something fundamentally different about this experience that, at least in some cases, I might prefer.
So let's talk a little bit about your products, right? You're not just offering services and consultation or do color grading or be a color scientist, but you also have, for example, different tools created to help filmmakers to find the right look quickly, easily. So you have your own look packs, I would call it. And so there are various packs actually and products you're offering on your website. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about this. So what are these products? What do these products encompass, and how do they help to or help colorists actually to do color with their work?
Yeah, so when I think about the products that I offer up to filmmakers or other colorists, really all of them, and there's a handful. There's my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. There's a couple of different sets of LUTs that are out there and available as well. And really all of those were created and released with the same passion in mind of really something that we began our conversation with today, that I realized early on in my career as a colorist that there is certain knowledge and certain color science that's really, really difficult to come by unless you happen to be working at one of a handful of really, really elite post-production facilities. And that's something that's always bothered me. I don't feel like that's right. I feel like if I want to go learn about astrophysics right now, I can go learn a lot about astrophysics on the internet, and with a sort of minimum of discernment, I can figure out like, well, that's probably not a reliable source of educational content about astrophysics, but I could go on Masterclass or anywhere else, and I can learn about astrophysics if that's my intent. Color grading and color science, it's actually much trickier. It's hard to find reliable information. It's hard to find reliable resources for doing this work at a high level and doing this work at a professional level. So that's really the aim and the intent of these products that I have out there and available, is to make information and tools available that put independent colorists, independent filmmakers on an equal footing with elite filmmakers and elite colorists. I can't give you the passion, I can't give you the drive, I can't put in the time for you, but if you're willing to put in those things, you're willing to invest in yourself, I am really passionate about facilitating your journey there and providing you with the same resources that the best in the world get to use.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You were describing it like if you don't have those tools or you know how to use them, it's kind of fighting with one hand behind the back, right? I mean, I like that. When you said that, I think you also said that in one of your videos. You're fighting with one hand on your back. So what do you mean with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about the relationship between color grading and color science and the role that those play with respect to one another, you can be the very best colorist in the world. In fact, you could take the very best colorist in the world. Think of whomever you like in this scenario, whomever is practicing at a high level, doing great work, consistently sculpting great images. Take that artist and try to envision what their practice would become if you were to remove the support of their color science team and of the tools, transforms, looks, and other proprietary assets that have been cultivated for them. Would their practice be unchanged? Of course not. It would be massively affected. That's a skilled operator. They bring something to the table that's unreplaceable, but the tools and assets and resources that they rely on to facilitate that process are also non-replaceable, irreplaceable. So in the same way, we can become the best colorist we can be by studying and by learning, but if we don't have similar resources in place, similar high quality color science supporting us, then we're going to be fighting with one hand behind our back.
Yes, and then you have this other one, what you call the Colorist 10 Commandments. I love this. I mean, everybody has a Bible. You have your 10 Commandments. That's cool. But think about it. You said that it originally started as a notebook, right, where you took notes, and it then somehow suddenly became a compilation for everybody who wants to start working in a career of color or media production. So that said, avoiding, again, the school of hard knocks and getting quicker to accelerate, what is it actually what this 10 Commandments is all about, so you get good images out there more easily, not without actually trial and error so much?
Yes, absolutely. So The Colorist 10 Commandments is a book that really, for me, it just started as my attempt to sort of encapsulate my guiding principles as a colorist. And this is something I'm really passionate about as a colorist. We tend to get quite fixated on software and on tools and on knobs and on LUTs when we are color grading. All those things are important. All those things play a role. But what's most important is the principles that guide our actions when we are color grading. So that's what the Colorist 10 Commandments is all about. It's not about, here's where you should move your lift knob. It's about, what are the principles that tell you what to reach for and when, and how to navigate the very complex considerations of any color grade in terms of how you give your clients what they want, how you arrive at the best result with the tools available to you. It's all about those guiding principles that should really exist upstream prior to the turning of any knob whatsoever. Without those principles, it doesn't really matter what knob you turn, your results are always going to be compromised. And with those principles, you'll find that you're very adaptable and you can adjust to circumstances or the needs of a project or the tools available to you quite nimbly because the principles remain the same. So that was the idea there. It was initially just jotting things down for myself, and then I realized by the time I had distilled it down into the most essential form that I could, that it was probably a pretty valuable document to share with my fellow colorists.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. I mean, for young filmmakers especially, right, or film students, because they have a starting point to get into the business, right? And the question is like in film school, for example, because as you said, it's really hard sometimes to find reliable resources, right? And so you came up with your own resources, you came up with your own stories and tools and white papers and whatever you offer, and just to make sure that people don't have to relearn everything, but they can accelerate, right? So because then you have the right source, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, these are principles that I arrived at in reverse. I arrived at them backwards. I arrived at them by trying 800 different ways of manipulating my nodes and my knobs and my tools until I started to get decent results. And as I started to get decent results, I became aware of, okay, what are the ideas that seem to really be working and what are the ones that just seem to fail every single time I try them, where when you have a resource like that you can start with, that can guide your process in the proper way, where you are starting from concept and letting that drive behavior as opposed to trying to sort of deduce a concept by looking at what behaviors prove functional or dysfunctional over far too long a period of time, which is how it went for me.
Yeah, and then you have your videos, right? Your tutorials or your background videos, which I also think are great. So for example, they have different lengths. I saw that. So some of them are basically like master classes where you go through a longer period and process of learning. But then you also have shorter videos like, for example, ASUS updates or camera updates or anything that's somehow up to date that helps you to understand technology better, utilize technology better. Can you maybe just give us a little idea on what those different videos are and how they're laid out so that people can quickly gain that information from a good, reliable source and having the chance to learn?
Yeah, certainly. So, you know, my YouTube channel began from really the same exact passion that I was just describing when we were talking about my book and my LUTs. It's really from this desire to make quality knowledge freely available to anyone who's willing to invest in acquiring it. So again, I can't press a button and download the knowledge into your brain, but if you want the knowledge, you should have access to it, and you certainly shouldn't be punished for seeking knowledge by getting bad information, which is something that I've seen far too much of with some of the other resources that are out there. So that's the whole premise behind my YouTube channel. And I think the best and most challenging part of something like YouTube is you end up creating very digestible, shorter pieces of content. Now, that might be 5 minutes, that might be an hour, but even an hour in the scheme of things is not that long to spend in a focused period of time trying to acquire something. That's the great part about YouTube, because you can learn more about how to achieve better balance in your images. You can learn more about that in the span of maybe 30 minutes of a series of a couple different videos and really have some new tools and some new ideas to try in your practice. The challenge of that is not a comprehensive, a systematic, or a rigorous sort of A to Z system through which you say, hey, you are perhaps a novice or an amateur colorist and you're looking to build yourself to a professional career. That would be difficult to do on YouTube. I won't say impossible, but that would be difficult because that type of pursuit really requires more of a systematic and intense course of study than you can get in 10, 20, or even 60-minute segments. And that was really where the Colorist Career Accelerator came in for me. Same idea as my book. How can I take all of this stuff that I've just had to sort of stumble into and figure out by doing it all the wrong ways first? How can I take all of that career's worth of experience and distill it down into a 4-day course that is intense and structured and rigorous and takes you from a colorist who wants to be working professionally to a colorist who's, like put up their flag for the world to see and says, hey, I'm a colorist, I'm ready to get to work, let's craft some beautiful images and give you everything that you need, not just on the technique and the color grading side, but on the business side and all the other aspects that go into actually building a career in this business, because I certainly had no clue myself, and I don't think I got anything right the first time. I just had to get it wrong enough times that I found what worked.
Yeah, but that's actually how learning works, right? I mean, you're adapting to it, and that's where you can create greatness, right? I think that's exactly what learning is all about, right? And so, I mean, in the end, I really would like to talk with you about one question we always ask our guests, and that question is like, if you would have to answer or finish the sentence I start, where I say, if you would say color matters because, why does color matter, right? So color matters because?
Color matters because it's the way we create feeling with images.
Oh, that's a beautiful answer. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. So thank you, Cullen, very much for being on our show. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Finally, we have the chance to have you as our special guest today. And we really look forward to see much more of your products and more about 10 commandments. Maybe we're going to have 20 commandments in the future, I don't know. And making that job of a colorist and color scientist so much more exciting, and that we have the chance to learn from you. Thank you, Cullen, and good luck in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.